Hi chickens, welcome to another instalment of my Self-Love September series on the channel. I hope that you are enjoying it. I'm going to be talking about rejection in this one. It's a bit of a crappy topic. I think if you're old enough to watch this video, then you're old enough to have experienced rejection on some level, whether it was professional, whether it was in friendship, whether it was in romance, whether it was in a number of different ways, whether you were rejected from a university. There's definitely a self-loving way to deal with being rejected and a not so self-loving way to deal with it. So hopefully this video resource is going to help you to differentiate between the two and to clock when you might be dealing with rejection in a way that is really not self-supportive and is not self-loving, so you can make the necessary changes to deal with rejection in a healthier way. Even though it does suck, it is shitty, and I think that's where I want to begin the video actually, is by saying that it's normal to be upset when you're rejected. It's normal to feel difficult feelings about it. It's normal to have to go through a process of recovering from it. I think a lot of people sort of strive to suppress the natural emotions that come up as a result of being rejected in some way. They try to ignore it, they try to stuff it down, they try to get straight back on the horse and keep going, or they kind of deny that they feel any type of negativity as the result of rejection at all. They pretend that it didn't bother them, they try and pass it off as something that really isn't a big deal, and that's because the ego is bruised, the ego is hurt, and somebody might not want to show others that they feel hurt by a rejection, so they try to stuff it down. And I think that that's probably where a resource like this should always begin, is by saying that it's normal to feel crappy about being rejected. It's okay to feel like you need to take some time to process it and just recover from the experience. Obviously you don't want to take too terribly long. You want to be able to get back on the horse in a reasonably timely fashion so you can carry on doing what you're trying to do and continue pursuing your dreams and living your life to the fullest and all that jazz. But it's totally normal to feel crappy about rejection. So I kind of want to start the resource there by saying that if you're the kind of person that normally tries to stuff the feelings down or ignore that they are really bothering you, then please know that it's okay to grieve whatever it was that you lost or whatever you were trying to obtain that you feel you were rejected from. It's okay to experience that low mood as a result of being rejected. That's completely normal, and it's normal to have to process that. One of the most common responses that people have to rejection is to see that rejection, whatever kind of rejection it is, as a symbol of a rejection of the complete self. So if you were rejected from a job that you applied for or that you interviewed for, instead of seeing a rejection as being a symbol of the fact that you weren't quite right for that position, or you got your CV in too late, somebody else turned up that had previous experience when you didn't, etc., you take it straight to the unself-loving place of deciding that the rejection is emblematic of the fact that you're not worthy as a human being, that you yourself as an individual are not good enough and somebody else is better. And I think that can be a very insidious way of responding to rejection that we might not actually realise that we are partaking in. I would ask you to consider the last few times you went through some kind of rejection or perceived rejection. From your point of view, did you see that as a symbol of something not being worthy about you, something not being right about you? Because the truth is that if you were rejected from a friendship because of a specific behaviour, let's say, that you exhibited, that other person wasn't cool with or wasn't comfortable with, it's that behaviour specifically that person is rejecting, and they could be rejecting that behaviour for all kinds of reasons that are personal to them. It could trigger them in a particular way, whatever the case may be. And for you to take that rejection and then kind of sort of see it as this symbol that you yourself, in your completeness, in all of your different varied ways, in your multi-dimensionality, are just not good enough, that's a big leap. So it's really important to recognise that we are rejected for something specific, which is a facet of our being, or a facet of the way we behaved or the way we came across in a situation, or something we said in a situation. A rejection is not a rejection of our whole beingness. It can certainly feel like that, and it's very easy to process rejection like that, but it's not helpful to process rejection like that. And if we recognise when we are processing rejection in that very extreme way, then we can sort of talk ourselves down from the ledge effectively and kind of be like, you know what, I'm actually starting to see this rejection as some kind of wholesale rejection of me because I'm unworthy, and that's actually not what happened, and I need to look at it and process it in a more realistic way than that, rather than really diving off into the deep end and taking it to a place of fundamental unworthiness. So if your manuscript was rejected by a publisher, it means that it wasn't the right manuscript for that publisher. Something about it was not what that publisher was looking for. It doesn't mean that you yourself as a writer are being completely rejected. It doesn't mean that you are not a good writer. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to submit your manuscript elsewhere. If you are rejected for a date or rejected for a relationship by somebody, it's because you don't have the specific qualities that they feel they are looking for a good romantic match at that time. It does not mean that you yourself are unworthy of romance, and it doesn't even mean that they've considered you unworthy of friendship. They have literally just looked at what you are specifically offering or what you are conveying to them, and there is something about the match that feels like a mismatch for them, and that's it. It doesn't have to be emblematic of your unworthiness or the fact that it's pointless to try to connect with people or try to pursue your dreams, because this rejection is a symbol of somehow an unworthiness in the foundation of self, you know. So it's like, it's basically about not taking it to that extremely overwrought, let's say even dramatic place, and bringing it back to a place that is more in keeping with the realistic situation that is occurring. I have a habit of saying that what the ego wants isn't always what the spirit needs, and this is something that has been very helpful for me to remember on my own journey. Sometimes my ego is clamoring for something, and my ego is visualizing that thing, visualizing that result, visualizing that manifestation, and my ego is getting absolutely high off of that. My ego thinks it's the best idea it's ever had, but spirit has other plans. And later down the line, with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of some distance and some sort of processing, I can see that, yeah, wow, okay, that thing my ego wanted was definitely not what my spirit needed, and what spirit had lined up for me was actually way better. And I can see now, with the benefit of hindsight, with all of the chips falling where they did, that actually what I wanted and what I was pursuing and what I was sad that I didn't get, or what I was really upset at being rejected from, actually wasn't what I needed at all. And I actually wrote something about this in my notes for this video when I was thinking about what I wanted to include, and I want to read it for you. It says, I often say that what the ego wants isn't always what the spirit needs, and rejection can be a cosmic defense against a bad decision or idea which doesn't seem so bad from where you're standing. In other words, the horizon towards which you are looking seemed clear and pleasant and worth pursuing, but the rejection prevented you from going over there and discovering the flesh-guzzling monster which was lying down just out of sight. Don't always be so quick to presume that something was supposed to turn out the way that you wanted it to. So sometimes it's worth looking at a rejection and seeing it as a potential protection against something that you can't actually recognize at the moment, but that you trust was actually not good for you. And a lot of people that are spiritually centered and live a spiritual life have recognized, with the benefit of hindsight, that that was exactly what was happening, that they couldn't see the potential danger or the potential negativity when they were in hot pursuit of that thing that they wanted. But actually, with the benefit of hindsight, after the rejection, they look back and they think, oh, thank God I was rejected from that job or that relationship, or thank God I went through that time of feeling like I was being rejected from that, because in hindsight it would have been the wrong thing for me, and if that door had opened for me, then these doors wouldn't have come into being and opened for me, and I can see now that this is actually the right way forward. So sometimes it does pay to think about times previously in life where you've experienced a rejection, and further down the line you've thought, that was a fucking close call. I'm overjoyed that that didn't come to anything, because actually this pathway that I'm on now, that I never could have seen from that previous position, is what I actually wanted and needed. When someone goes through a painful rejection, when it's something that they really wanted and they got rejected, they can move into a state of what's known as learned helplessness. And a lot of the time this can come from either having the emotional shock and sadness of a big rejection that felt really weighty, or it can come from experiencing a series of rejections which went in some kind of pattern. Learned helplessness is basically this state of being where you've convinced yourself that there's nothing you can really do to change your situation, there's no point in trying, there's no point in helping yourself, and actually all of the evidence is to the contrary, that it is totally worth going over there and trying that door, or totally worth taking that new road and seeing what happens. But because of the way that you've responded emotionally to rejection, you have convinced yourself that there's no point, that nothing is going to change, that there is nothing that you can do to empower yourself, there is nothing that you can do to give yourself a different experience. Learned helplessness, there's studies that have been done about it that have shown that if somebody experiences something negative and it happens in a certain pattern and it creates a certain response, they, in a completely different situation, will assume that the same thing will happen again. And you can see learned helplessness in experiments that have been done with animal behaviour, with pet behaviour, where if you lock a door and the animal tries the door and they can't get out, then you put them in another room, or you try the experiment on a different day and they just assume that door is going to be locked, even though it's wide open and they can totally get to the food, but they're not trying to get to the food because they're just assuming that they tried and they failed, so that's that. And the human psyche can work a lot like that. Even if the situation is different, the parameters are different, it could be worth trying again. Learned helplessness sets in and it just makes you feel really low vibe and really stagnant, and you kind of convince yourself there's nothing you can do. Now, obviously, only you can take responsibility for identifying a state of learned helplessness and actually having the bravery to get back on the horse and try again and really pursue things again. So if you recognise you're in that state of learned helplessness, I encourage you to acknowledge it. I encourage you to make a commitment to changing it, even if the risk that you take is very, very small, even if you start with very, very small baby steps to try to bring yourself back out of your shell again and actually start to try for things again and start to get excited about the process of trying for things again, because it is exciting, but learned helplessness kind of makes that memory of the excitement of trying for things to be very, very distant and very fuzzy and hazy, and it's replaced by this feeling of apathy, essentially. And it's your responsibility in your life, just as it's my responsibility in my life, to identify that apathy, clock it, and decide to do something about it. A lot of the time it's actually much easier to identify learned helplessness in somebody else than it is to identify it in yourself. And you may have had an experience of trying to convince a friend or a loved one of yours to come out of their pit of doom and gloom and despair and get back on the horse and fucking ride that horse into the sunset. You may actually have been that cheerleader or just that really frustrated person on the sidelines saying, look, it's been long enough since that rejection, you need to get up, you need to dust yourself off, you need to find the courage to make the best of it and keep moving towards your dream. And so it's much easier to identify someone else who's let rejection get the better of them over time and has let rejection sort of write the script for them. But actually, when you're in a state of learned helplessness, when you're feeling apathetic or stroppy about rejection that's occurred with you, it's much harder to look in the mirror and confront that and say, yeah, you know what, I'm actually being really apathetic and I'm telling myself that the story's already been written and actually I'm writing it every day with the decisions that I'm making. So let me make the decision not to sit here and kind of wallow in apathy, but actually to do something and make something happen. It doesn't hurt to examine a repeated pattern of rejection and see what you can learn from it. You know, if you keep going for jobs using the exact same CV and pretty much the exact same covering letter, it wouldn't hurt to change it up. It wouldn't hurt to do something different, try something different. If you keep getting rejected in social situations using the same techniques, saying the same kinds of things, adopting the same body language, etc., again, it wouldn't hurt to try changing things up, doing things differently, thinking about what kinds of variables you might want to tinker with and change. I don't see this as unself-loving. I see this as showing that you are willing to adapt, you are willing to strengthen your technique, you're willing to accept that there are things you could be trying that you didn't realise or you weren't thinking of, and you're willing to showcase different parts of your personality or your abilities. You're willing to use different parts of your skill set and get things moving in a different way. You're willing to accept that if you shift the energy, the responses tend to shift as well. So I don't see that as unself-loving. I think sometimes a repeated pattern of rejection provides us with some very interesting information to help us to move towards success more, thinking about what we can change, what kinds of variables we can tweak. So if you know that you have a repeated pattern of rejection, you know, really think about that, sit with that, think about what kind of information that can offer to you that you might want to use to your advantage. So like I said at the beginning of the video, you're going to want to have that period of recovering, being sad. You know, you might want to stay in instead of going out and just kind of vegetate, sort of mope around, you know, self-comfort, self-soothe, eat some good food, watch something good on Netflix, just kind of like, you know, decompress into it a bit, because it can feel deflating. But then I would recommend that you set a time limit for moping, set a time limit for wallowing, so you don't end up in learned helplessness or any of that stuff. You want to avoid all that. And so really give yourself that opportunity to just sort of like stroke your own head and say there and it was a bit shit and that didn't feel good. But then as quickly as you can, you want to get back on the horse, and if there is a repeated pattern of rejection, use that information. Think of that as a gift to you. Think about what you are going to change, how you are going to adapt, how you are going to be more inventive, or sort of tackle things from a different angle next time, approach things differently the next time. As I mentioned to you guys in my previous video, a lot of the topics that I'm covering in this year's Self-Love September are suggestions that were recommended to me when I did my Facebook live stream, asking people for opinions on what I should cover, and for basically the things that people are having issues with that they thought I could help with. And the reason that I'm doing this video on rejection is because somebody asked me to make a video about that topic, but the way that the question was phrased was very interesting. They asked me to talk about how to handle rejection of one's overall personality. So this individual said that they feel like people just do not get them. Like overall, across the board, in the relationships and the friendship groups, it's like they're rejected just for being who they are. And obviously that is super difficult and it is painful. But the way that I would ask you to break it down, if you feel like you tend to be rejected for who you are you genuinely being rejected for the entirety of who you actually are as a person? Are you genuinely being rejected for your entire personality? Or is it possible that you are being rejected due to some behaviours that you exhibit in your personality, which might be hard for other people to navigate? This requires practicing some introspection, and it might seem counter to the journey of self-love, but I personally don't think it is. I do not believe that self-love is about not making any changes to yourself whatsoever. I don't believe that self-love is about saying, well, I exhibit these behaviours and that's who I am, and my job is to love myself for that. I feel like sometimes self-love is about looking at the way that you behave, the behaviours that you exhibit, the things that you tend to say and do over and over again that may not be helpful and could be tweaked or lessened. I think sometimes there are certain behaviours that make it difficult for people to connect with who we really truly are. I think there are some behaviours and some tendencies that make it difficult for people to see what is wonderful about us, because those behaviours or those tendencies act as a bit of a barrier. I don't think there's anything wrong with making the decision that you want to try and lessen those behaviours so that other behaviours or character traits of yours can come into the foreground and can provide more of a sense for people of who you are in a way that is different and will afford you opportunities to connect with people differently to how you used to. When I first moved really seriously back into spirituality in my almost mid-20s, when I went through my big breakup and I really started to get super back into this stuff, I thought a lot about energy and how I've always sort of had a sense of the vibes, man, the vibes in the room, the vibes in a group dynamic. But I always had a little bit of a blind spot when it came to the energy that I was utilising in the space. And I started to realise in my mid-20s and late 20s, when I was around people who were extremely gregarious, very vivacious, very extroverted, that sometimes they would take up a great deal of the energy in the room. They would kind of suck the energy from others, and they would be almost like this big energy vortex that was just gobbling energy all the time, and they were a lot of effort to be around, and you would feel like it was an energy drain to be around people like that. And I started recognising from my exploration of this that I was one of those, probably in a lot of cases, one of those energy vortex kind of people that is quite energetically high maintenance. And I realised that I wanted to take my foot off the gas in that regard. I wanted to be somebody that could be more chill, that could hold more space for other people to talk. I wanted to be somebody who wasn't that energetically high maintenance. I wanted to check myself in that regard. Was that unself-loving of me? I don't personally think so. I wasn't being mean to myself. I wasn't berating myself. I was literally just deciding that I'd recognise that there was this part of my character that might make it more difficult for people to be in my presence for long periods of time, and might make it less pleasant as an experience for them to be in my company. And I didn't want that anymore. I wanted to be able to relate to people differently. So I felt this was a very self-loving conversation that I was having with myself. And if I had experienced a repeated pattern of social rejection, that definitely would have been one of the things I would have come to. Is just basically this idea that, like, you know what, maybe I need to take my foot off the gas a bit more, make it less about me, open up more space for others to talk about them, and generally ask more questions. I'm really good at asking questions now, and I'm genuinely interested in people. But I think in my mid-20s, it was more about kind of like being so invested in telling my story and conveying who I was that I think I was missing the opportunity to ask those questions. And then I would be unfulfilled by the experience and I wouldn't even realise why. And it would only be later that I would clock why. It was because I felt like I hadn't engaged the other person enough and gotten enough of their feedback or been interested enough in what was going on with them. So I kind of learned to be a better listener and to have more enriching experiences on that basis. That is not unself-loving. That is literally you leveling with yourself, having that introspection and being like, okay, that's something that I can improve. That's something that I can work on. So I would definitely ask you to think about that. If you feel like you are rejected overall, like your personality is rejected overall, definitely ask yourself to consider, is it your personality completely in essence that's being rejected, or are there certain behaviours that are not helping you to really show the fullness of your character and the beauty of who you can be as a human being? It's okay to recognise that those behaviours have become familiar for you, they've become something that you do maybe without thinking, or you've told yourself that you can't change those things, and maybe it's time for you to have a rethink about that. Honey bunnies, thank you so much for watching this resource. I hope that it's been helpful. I would love to know down below what your experiences have been with rejection. How do you cope with rejection? Has there been anything in this video that's helped you to understand how you could deal with rejection in a more functional, self-loving way? I would love to know what your history has been with rejection and how you've learned to cope with it better. It's definitely been a journey for me. I'm sure it's been a journey for plenty of you, and I hope this resource has offered help where needed. There will be a few more videos coming in the Self-Love September series, so I hope you're enjoying them, and I will really look forward to delivering the last few resources to you before I get into some shadowy stuff and some Samhain stuff and some other bits and pieces in October. There's quite a few unboxings coming, I will admit, in October and November as well. There's some awesome things that I'm very much looking forward to, so stay tuned for that. And if you're on the self-love gravy train with me, thank you very much for imbibing these resources. I really appreciate your time, and I would appreciate your input down below. I find the comments super interesting during SLS. So much love and self-love, baby cakes, don't forget. Blessed be. Mwah!